When my grandson stepped into my kitchen that Saturday morning, the sunlight was already cutting sharp through the lace curtains. He was taller than I remembered, broader in the shoulders too, but he still had that quick, darting way of glancing around the room like he was making mental notes. He put his phone down on the counter, poured himself a cup of coffee without asking, and then leaned against the sink as if this was his house, not mine. "Does the 9,000 I send cover your needs, Grandma?" I nodded before I could even think about it. My mouth smiled. My head bobbed slightly, and I even heard myself say, "Yes, darling, it's more than enough." But inside it was as if someone had taken a knife to a locked drawer and flung everything onto the floor. Years of quiet swallowing, of pretending not to notice, of keeping my voice soft even when my heart was burning. 9,000. He said it like a young man talking about pocket change, but I knew where that money came from. And I knew what had been taken from me long before a single check was ever written. My eyes stayed on his face, that sweet, clean-shaven face, and I thought about the two people who had raised him, my son, and her. Let me know where you're listening from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this story speaks to you, share your thoughts below. Don't skip, because what happens at the end will surprise you more than the betrayal itself. He was asking about my needs as though he truly cared, but I saw it for what it was, a casual check-in to reassure himself he'd done his duty. The same kind of duty his parents had talked about when they'd taken over handling the finances for me after my hip surgery almost 15 years ago. The same arrangement that was supposed to be for my comfort, but somehow left me signing papers I didn't understand and watching my own house title vanish from my desk. The kitchen smelled of coffee and lemon floor polish, but I could feel that old stale scent from my memories, that hospital smell of disinfectant and fear. That was when it had all started. My son had come to my bedside smiling too brightly, telling me not to worry about the mortgage or the bills. "We've got it covered, Mom," he'd said. I'd believed him. I kept stirring sugar into my tea, pretending I was considering his question. "More than enough," I repeated. I didn't want him to see anything in my face. He took a sip of his coffee, pulled out his phone, and started tapping away at something. That was the new way of conversation I supposed, always a part of them somewhere else. I watched his hands. They were my son's hands, and for a moment it almost made me soften, until I remembered the letter I'd found hidden in my desk drawer 2 years ago. The one from the bank. The one that proved I'd been removed from my own property records without a single conversation. He was talking now about a trip he wanted to take with friends, something about Italy and the wine country. He told me not to worry about groceries because he'd already transferred the monthly money. My hands wrapped tighter around my mug. I'd lived long enough to know that sometimes the ones who betray you don't even think they've done anything wrong. Sometimes they build their own little stories, where they're the hero, the caretaker, the generous one. And they tell it so often they believe it themselves. When he left an hour later, promising to come by again soon, I sat at the kitchen table long after his car pulled out of the driveway. I stared at the pale ring his coffee cup had left on the wood, and I thought about the years that had passed since my life had stopped being my own. It was almost laughable the way everyone assumed I was fragile, that I was lucky to have them looking after me, that I didn't see the way money moved out of accounts in little drips, never enough to cause alarm, but enough to make me wonder. That I didn't notice when my son stopped asking what I wanted for birthdays and started giving me practical gifts like grocery vouchers and prepaid utility cards. No, I noticed. I noticed everything. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that silence makes people careless. Silence is not weakness. Silence is space. And in that space, you can think. You can plan. That day, as I sat with my tea gone cold, I realized my grandson's question wasn't really about my needs. It was about his peace of mind, and that was something I could use. Because if he thought 9,000 was all it took to keep me comfortable, he had no idea what I'd been doing quietly for years. No idea that every polite smile, every grateful nod, every thank you dear was just another stitch in the quilt I'd been making, one that would cover me long after they were gone. Before the papers and the signatures, before the polite lies, my life was small and full in a way that made sense. I worked mornings at the clinic, afternoons at the school cafeteria, and evenings at home with my boy. Money was always tight, but time had a rhythm. We measured seasons by the raspberries ripening along the back fence and the first frost on the garbage bins. I made soups that stretched over 3 days. I took in mending for neighbors. I learned how to fix a leaking washer with a butter knife and a prayer. It wasn't glamour, it was ours. Back then, I wore my wedding band like it meant second win, not completion. His father and I were good at the same small things. We could pack a trunk for a weekend with 1 bag each and a cooler of sandwiches. We painted rooms together and argued about edges. He teased me about my labels on everything: flour, sugar, rice. He'd say I made life look like a hardware store. I'd say it kept chaos honest. Then he got sick. It wasn't dramatic at first. Just fatigue. A cough that lingered, the kind of thing you mention and then forget until you can't. The hospital days were fluorescent and slow. I remember doing math on napkins, how many hours I could work, how far the savings might stretch. When he died, people brought casseroles and advice. You're strong, they said. You'll manage. Strength wasn't the problem. Paperwork was. Insurance forms, mortgage numbers, a stack of envelopes that never stopped arriving. I kept the house by trimming everything else. New shoes could wait. Vacations could be afternoons at the public beach. My son got the last piece of chicken. I ate the crispy bit stuck to the pan. It wasn't a sacrifice to me. It was a choice I made over and over. He was 8 then, a boy who liked maps and the smell of new pencils. We built our routines like scaffolding. Saturday mornings were for pancakes and radio. Sunday evenings batch cooking for the week. I taught him how to read labels, how to scrub a pan, how to fold a fitted sheet. He taught me that Lego instructions are serious business and that sometimes the right answer is to abandon the instructions and make a spaceship anyway. At night, after he fell asleep, I'd sit at the table with a calculator and checkbook. I tracked every dime. I made it a game. Could I shave $5 off the electricity by turning off the hallway light? Could I get 3 dinners from a whole chicken and still make broth? Some months we did better than others. I learned to sell things before they became urgent winter coats in early fall, the bassinet he'd outgrown in the spring. People would come by and hand me cash and tell me stories. My sister had one like this. My aunt swore by this slow cooker. I listened because it made the exchange feel like a favor passing between us, not a measurement of what I couldn't afford. I put the money in a tin under the flour. I called it my what if fund. What if the roof leaked? What if the car refused to start? What if my boy needed a tutor? He grew kind in the way children learn kindness by seeing it. When I brought home bruised apples for half price, he cut out the soft spots without complaint and said they tasted sweeter. When I got a parking ticket I couldn't argue away, he emptied his piggy bank and tried to hand me the coins. I didn't take them. I told him the job of a mother is to build a life where a child's coins are never needed. It sounded brave in the moment. It kept me honest when I wanted to cry. On nights when the house felt too big and too quiet, I would stand in his doorway and watch him breathe, counting the inhale, hold the exhale, like it could anchor me. He did well in school. Better than well. He had a way of reading a chapter and pulling out its threads. Teachers sent home notes with words like promise and potential. I kept every paper he was proud of. I hid them in a shoebox with the hospital bracelets and a paper crane he made for his father's funeral. He asked me once if we would ever be rich. I told him we were just not in the way people counted. He rolled his eyes and then leaned his head on my shoulder. He stayed there long enough to make the answer feel less like a joke and more like a vow. The house itself was modest, but it became a map of our years. The nick in the hallway where he rammed a scooter. The paint smudges on the baseboard from a rushed job before a school open house. The garden small at first, then bolder with herbs and tomatoes that made August taste like victory. I planted lavender by the porch because it made the evenings feel quieter. He planted sunflowers because he said they looked like they knew their own worth. We hung a bird feeder and learned the names of the ones who visited. Chickadee, nuthatch, goldfinch on lucky days. I liked the steadiness of it. Seeds and birds come. Effort in life returns. Work eased, then tightened, then eased again like the tide. I moved from the cafeteria to a front desk job at the clinic and felt proud when my name tag said coordinator. It wasn't fancy. It was a recognition that I was the one people trusted to solve things. I kept a small notebook in my apron and wrote down everything I didn't understand, then asked the nurses after hours. What's a deductible? How do you read this form? I learned because I had to. I learned because every piece of knowledge felt like a fence post hammered into the ground, one more safeguard against the wind. He got older. Teen years brought noise and quiet in unpredictable doses. He saved for his first laptop by mowing lawns and reshelving books at the library. When he got accepted to university, we celebrated with cheap champagne and cake from the grocery bakery. We didn't know the icing would leave blue tongues. We laughed anyway. Financial aid took the front seat, and I took an extra weekend shift. We made it work by being blunt with each other. That was our strength. No pretending, no grand gestures. If we couldn't afford something, we said so. The yeses meant more because they were earned. When he met her, I was ready to make room. I had no dreams of being a center star. I had no appetite for meddling. The first time she came by, she brought almond croissants and a candle that smelled like linen. She said my home was charming and asked if I'd considered refinishing the floors. I said not yet. She had opinions shaped like gifts. I accepted them one by one, smiling, filing away her tone for later. I told myself this was new to her. I told myself love looks funny from the outside. I watched how my son watched her. That told me more than her words. Holidays shifted as they do. We tried new rhythms. Some years they hosted. Some years I did. I kept a drawer of napkins for every season. I kept dog treats in case they ever brought one. She never ate much, and she apologized for everything. It made me want to feed her. It made me want to arm her. Either way, I set an extra place like superstition. We took photos after dessert, all of us leaning in. If you'd walked by then, you would have seen what I wanted you to see. A family figuring it out in good faith. I can't pinpoint the moment the air started to change. Part 3 has its reasons, but Part 2 was about believing that love and effort could hold. It wasn't naivete. It was practice. I spent decades laying down small bricks of steadiness recipes, memorized bills paid on time, apologies made before resentment hardened. The sacrifices were not dramatic. They were daily. And in those years, my son was my partner in that work, even when he didn't know it. He grew inside the boundaries of my choices. He grew strong there. That mattered to me more than any account balance. On the morning of his graduation, I pressed his gown and stitched a loose button on his shirt with the last of a spool his father once used. He hugged me so hard I stepped back to catch my breath. He said, "We did it, Mom." I said, "You did it," and then slipped cash into his pocket anyway. Habits like that don't break. They evolve. I believed then that the future would be a longer version of that hug work relief, the steady landing. If I held that belief too long, well, that is another chapter. But it was honest while it lasted. It was my truth before the turn. It began like a shadow at the corner of my vision there, but easy to dismiss. The first year after the wedding, they still came by on Sundays sometimes for a late lunch, sometimes just for coffee. She would bring flowers in paper wraps, and he would head straight for the fridge to see what leftovers I had. The rhythm wasn't quite the same, but it was still ours. Then the calls started to thin out. At first it was small things. He'd text instead of phoning. She'd say they were just swamped but promised to come by soon. I told myself they were busy building their own life. That's what you want for your children, to see them fly. But it's one thing to see them flying toward something, another to watch them drift away without looking back. Birthdays changed. No more Sunday lunch with a cake cooling on the counter. Now it was, let's do dinner in the city, or we'll swing by next week if we can. When I offered to cook, she'd suggest a restaurant instead. "It's easier for you," she'd say, smiling. I didn't argue, but I noticed. Easier for me was never the point. Money began slipping into the edges of conversations. It was never direct. She'd mention how much the wedding had cost, how rent in the city was astronomical, how they dipped into savings for a new car. My son would nod along, adding his own quiet sighs. I knew the pattern: drop the weight of your struggle just enough that the other person feels the pull. I'd done it myself years ago without realizing it when I'd wanted help with the roof repairs. The difference was, when I asked, I meant to repay. It was around this time that he offered so casually to help with the bills. I didn't think I needed help, but he spoke as if it were already decided. "It'll just be easier if I handle the payments directly. One less thing for you to worry about." She chimed in that she'd take care of grocery orders too. It sounded generous. It also sounded like the closing of a door I hadn't realized was open. I let them. That was my first mistake, though I didn't see it then. From there, the shift was subtle but steady. If I mentioned wanting to repaint the living room, she'd remind me that money's tight right now. If I thought about replacing the toaster, he'd say, "It's still working, Mom. Let's not be wasteful." I began feeling like a guest in my own home, asking permission just to use my own money. Friends would ask, "How's your boy doing?" And I'd say, "Busy but good," because that was easier than explaining the thin thread we were hanging on. You don't tell people your child is pulling away in slow motion. You don't tell them that you've started rehearsing conversations in your head because you're afraid the wrong word will push them further. There were signs I ignored. One afternoon, while he was fixing the porch light, I brought him a glass of lemonade. He had his phone open, the bank app on the screen, and I caught the reflection in the glass door, my account, not his. I asked about it, and he brushed it off with a laugh. Just checking to make sure the utility payment went through Mom. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself trust meant not peering too closely. But then came the first missed detail, the property tax notice addressed to care of my son at his city address. I called the office confused, and they told me the change had been made months ago. Family arrangements, the clerk said, like it explained everything. I didn't correct her. My voice was too tight. The next slip was a conversation at a family barbecue. I was standing by the grill when her sister asked if I'd decided on that condo yet. I blinked at her. She looked embarrassed, then mumbled something about, "Oh, I must have misunderstood." I let it slide, but my stomach felt hollow. That night, I went over my old files. Some statements were missing. Others looked lighter. Not empty, but less than I remembered. I told myself I could ask him, but I already knew the answer. He'd give some combination of, "You must be mistaken," and "We're just simplifying things for you." It's strange how quickly you can adapt to being managed. You start doubting your own memory. Was there really more in that account? Did I pay that bill twice? And every time you question it, they soothe you just enough to keep you quiet. The moment that sealed it for me was Christmas Eve. I had saved up to buy him a watch he'd once admired in a shop window, nothing extravagant, but a step above the usual. When he unwrapped it, he smiled, but it was her face I noticed. The quick glance, the almost imperceptible frown. Later in the kitchen, she said, "You really shouldn't be spending so much on gifts, you know. We're trying to be careful with your budget." Your budget. 2 words that told me more than all the missing statements combined. My budget wasn't mine anymore. After they left that night, I sat on the couch in the dark, the Christmas lights blinking in the reflection of the window. I thought about the years I'd spent keeping the house afloat, the decades of making ends meet without ever once needing someone to tell me how. And now here I was being told what was easier for me and what I shouldn't be spending. It wasn't just about the money. It was about ownership of my choices, my time, my independence. They'd started taking it piece by piece so slowly that I almost thanked them for it. I didn't confront them that night. I didn't even call. But in that quiet living room with the blinking lights and the watch box still on the coffee table, I felt something settle in me. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was awareness. And awareness I knew could grow into something much stronger if I just let it. I stopped asking questions. That was the first step. Not out of defeat, though I'm sure that's what they thought, but because I wanted to see what would happen when they believed I wasn't paying attention. When my son said, "We'll handle the renewal paperwork this year," I smiled and said, "Thank you." When she mentioned she'd already placed the grocery order, I said, "That's a relief." I gave them no resistance, no reason to sharpen their explanations. I let the rope go slack, knowing people trip more often when they think the path is clear. The house became quieter in ways that had nothing to do with noise. I moved slower, not because my joints ached, though they did, but because I wanted time to notice everything. The mail. The way my son held his phone tilted away when I was nearby. The sudden appearance of branded shopping bags in their car when they claimed to be watching expenses. The faint smell of her perfume on papers they dropped off, signing something somewhere without me present. I began keeping a small notebook again, just like I used to for bills and grocery lists. Only this time the entries weren't about recipes or sale prices. They were dates, amounts, little notes. April 12th. No deposit from pension May. 6th grocery total higher than usual. June 18th bank letter arrived at their address. I kept the notebook in the lining of my old sewing kit. Nobody looked there. Every conversation became an observation. My son's eyes darted more when we talked about finances, but less when we talked about the weather. She grew warmer in tone when she mentioned taking care of everything, but clipped when I asked about specific numbers. They didn't know that I noticed. They didn't know that I could sit at a table nodding while cataloging every misplaced pause. The social invitations dwindled even more. Family barbecues without an invite, holiday dinners too hectic for me to attend. I began hearing news about my own relatives through neighbors instead of directly. My son still called, but the calls felt rehearsed. "How are you? Need anything?" "Okay, talk soon." I gave short answers matching his rhythm. Silence has a strange way of making you sharper. You hear the creak of a floorboard and know which step caused it. You feel the shift in someone's breathing when they move from casual talk to guarding information. I learned the cadence of their half-truths so well I could have finished their sentences for them. Then one afternoon, I saw the first real crack. I was dusting the bookshelf when the landline rang, a rarity since most people called my mobile. It was a woman from the insurance company. She asked if I'd received the new beneficiary paperwork I'd requested. I told her I hadn't. She hesitated, then read off the mailing address they had on file. It was my son's, not mine. I thanked her, hung up, and sat down with the dust cloth still in my hand. I didn't call him. I didn't even make a note in the book. This wasn't the time to confront. This was the time to let the thread unravel just a little more. People who think they're clever rarely stop tugging at something once they've started. I adjusted my routines to make myself look smaller. I stopped going into town as often, letting them think I was becoming more dependent. I asked them to pick up a few things for me, cheap items, nothing to raise suspicion. I watched how quickly they'd suggest substitutions, or how often the receipt didn't come back with the bag. One Sunday, when they dropped off groceries, I noticed a bank folder in the back seat of their car. The logo was the same as mine. They didn't see me glance at it. They didn't hear me memorize the branch location printed on the folder. That week, I took the bus into the city, went to that branch, and quietly requested copies of any account statements with my name on them. The woman behind the counter frowned at her screen, then printed a stack of papers. I thanked her and tucked them into my handbag. It wasn't until I was back home in the quiet of my kitchen that I read through them. Several transactions had been marked as joint authorization. Only one of those signatures was mine. The thing about betrayal is that it's not just the act. It's the casualness. The way they assume you won't notice. The way they act as if the world naturally tilts in their favor, and your place is to simply accept it. That casualness, more than anything, made me certain they wouldn't see me coming. By the end of that summer, my notebook was nearly full. Dates, amounts, overheard phrases. I had the makings of a pattern, a clear, steady erosion of my independence disguised as care. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends. Not my neighbors. Not even the old friend who still called once a month to check in. I just waited. I smiled. I thanked them for every favor. And I began to think about what I would do when the time was right. It wasn't going to be an explosion. I had no appetite for shouting matches or slammed doors. No. The thing about silence is that it gives you patience. It teaches you to move like water, quiet, persistent, unstoppable. They thought I was fading. They thought I was grateful. They didn't know I was gathering. The plan didn't arrive in one burst. It was more like a quilt, pieces collected over weeks stitched together in the privacy of my own mind. I'd always believed in solving problems quietly without theatrics. This would be no different. If they wanted to treat me like a bystander in my own life, then I would become one until the moment I stepped forward and took center stage again. The first piece came from that stack of bank statements I'd hidden under the towels in the linen closet. I went through them slowly, marking each transaction that had nothing to do with me. Home decor stores I'd never visited, payments to contractors I'd never hired, a weekend booking at a hotel in the city under their names using my joint account. I didn't need to guess how many more existed. The proof was already enough. The second piece came from a conversation with a woman named Carol who I'd met years ago at the clinic. She'd worked as a legal secretary for 3 decades before retiring. We ran into each other at the farmer's market one morning, and over coffee I asked how one might simplify their estate to make things easier down the line. Carol's eyes softened. "Easier for you or for them?" she asked. I smiled and didn't answer. She gave me the name of a lawyer she trusted, a man who, in her words, makes everything very clear. The third piece was timing. I knew if I moved too quickly, I'd alert them. They'd start locking things down, asking questions, maybe even moving faster on whatever they had planned. No, I needed to stretch the quiet long enough for them to forget I might have teeth. I made an appointment with the lawyer under the pretense of needing help with future planning. He was a man in his 60s, with careful eyes and a habit of listening longer than most people are comfortable with. I handed him my notebook, every page, every date, every note. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he leaned back, laced his fingers together, and said, "You've already done most of the work. Over the next 3 months, we built something they couldn't see coming. I shifted my pension deposits into a new account, one they couldn't access. I retitled certain assets into a trust with a beneficiary list that excluded my son and his wife. We arranged for my property to transfer automatically to that trust upon my death, bypassing probate entirely. He explained how this would make it nearly impossible for anyone to contest. I listened, nodding, feeling each change like the click of a lock. The beauty of it was that from the outside, nothing changed. They still picked up my groceries. They still handled my bills. They still believed I was living inside the narrow little space they'd built for me. What they didn't know was that the space was hollow now, a stage prop. The real foundation was elsewhere. I even began giving them small victories just to keep their confidence high. I'd sigh about how complicated the bank paperwork was. I'd thank them for explaining those things I just can't keep up with anymore. I saw the satisfaction in their faces, the belief that they were in control, that I was grateful for their management. It was the best camouflage I could have asked for. One afternoon, when they were dropping off a package for me to sign, I deliberately signed my name a little shakier than usual. She glanced at it and said, "We'll take care of more of this next year." I smiled. That would be lovely. Behind the curtain, I was making copies of every document I signed. I kept them in a fireproof box I'd bought with cash from a yard sale cache they didn't know I had. The box was stored at Carol's house, along with a backup copy of my trust documents and a sealed letter to my lawyer explaining everything in my handwriting. It wasn't revenge in the classic sense. I wasn't going to ruin them or drag them into court unless they forced me. This was self-preservation, pure and simple. It was reclaiming the ground they'd quietly stolen from under my feet. And if in the process they found themselves holding an empty shell instead of the life they thought they'd inherited, well, that was simply the cost of their choices. By the time autumn rolled around, I was ready for the final piece. My lawyer suggested one more meeting to finalize my will. I asked him to keep the changes sealed until my passing, unless I instructed otherwise. He agreed. If you ever do want them to know, he said it might be wise to tell them in person. Leave no room for them to twist your words. I thought about that for days. Did I want them to know now, or did I want to let the shock hit when it was too late for them to maneuver? In the end, I decided on something in between. I would give them just enough to feel the shift, but not enough to prepare. The moment would need to be quiet, private, unmistakable, and I knew exactly when it would happen. It started with small slips on their end, barely noticeable if you weren't watching closely. But I was watching, always watching. One Saturday afternoon, they arrived later than usual with my groceries. My son was quieter than normal, his eyes distant. She carried the bags inside, chattering about how he's just been tired lately while avoiding looking at him. I didn't ask. I just took note. The first real crack came a week later. My neighbor, Mrs. Adams, stopped me at the mailbox to thank me for recommending that painter. I had no idea what she was talking about. She said he'd done a wonderful job on her fence and mentioned how my son had given her the contact and even said you were paying for it. My fingers tightened on the stack of mail. I smiled, nodded, and let her talk. When I checked my bank statement that evening, there it was, a payment to a contractor's account I'd never seen before. I didn't need to guess where the money went. Then came the phone call. A man's voice, brisk and professional. This is a courtesy reminder regarding the overdue balance on your line of credit. My line of credit had been untouched for years. I asked for details. He hesitated, then told me the last 2 withdrawals had been jointly authorized. I thanked him, hung up, and sat at the table until the room felt too still to breathe in. It wasn't just the money. It was the unraveling of their story, the little mistakes that happen when people think they've already won. My son's casual mention of a surprise getaway during one visit, followed by a social media photo of them sipping wine in a place I knew they couldn't afford without help. Her offhand complaint about their credit card limits when she thought I wasn't listening. By midwinter, the mask was slipping faster. He started forgetting which lies he'd told me. One week he said their car insurance had gone up unexpectedly. The next, he claimed they'd paid it off in full for the year. She once mentioned an investment opportunity they were considering, then backtracked so quickly you could almost hear the words scraping the floor. I never confronted them. Not yet. Instead, I leaned into their narrative, the fragile dependent mother who needed guidance. I asked more questions about their lives, nodded sympathetically at their hardships, and even let them believe I was worried about my rising expenses. The more I played along, the looser their grip became. They'd begun to underestimate me, and that was exactly where I wanted them. The real turning point came in early spring. My grandson stopped by on his own. He looked uneasy, as if he was carrying something heavy in his chest. Over tea, he blurted out, "Grandma, I think Mom and Dad are, I don't know, stressed about money. They've been fighting a lot." His eyes darted toward the window, like saying it out loud might make them appear. I kept my face still, my voice calm. "Money can make people forget themselves," I said. He nodded, not understanding how close to the truth that was. It wasn't long after that when my son slipped completely. He came over one afternoon without her. Said he needed to borrow a few thousand until his next paycheck. He framed it as temporary, just a cushion. He promised it would come right back. I told him I'd think about it, then sent him home empty-handed. That night I transferred the last of the funds from my old account into the trust. The shell they'd been feeding from was now truly empty. Over the following weeks, I watched their control falter. Bills they were handling started arriving late. My pension payments, now redirected, no longer appeared in the joint account. I could almost feel their confusion, like rats in a maze suddenly finding the walls had moved. They didn't confront me outright, but I saw it in their eyes during the next visit. The calculation, the uncertainty. They were trying to figure out what had changed without revealing how much they depended on things staying the same. It was a dangerous stage for them. I'd spent months gathering my protection brick by brick. Now all I had to do was wait for the right moment to let them see just enough of what I'd built to understand they'd lost the game. And I wouldn't need to raise my voice once. I chose a Thursday afternoon. Thursdays had always been neutral ground in our family, too far from the weekend for big plans, too close to Monday for arguments to have much fuel left. I called my son and his wife that morning, told them I'd made a pot of tea and had something I wanted to talk about. I used the tone I'd perfected over the years, light, almost hesitant, the kind that makes people think they're walking into a conversation they'll control. They arrived just after 2. She came in first, her perfume hitting the air before her voice did. He followed, phone in hand, thumbs moving. I gestured toward the living room. The tea tray was already set out, china cups, lemon slices, the good shortbread. The fire was on, though it was mild outside. We made small talk. Weather. My neighbor's new dog. The trouble with the recycling schedule. I poured tea, watched their hands, noted how hers trembled slightly as she stirred in sugar. I've been going over some papers I began. I didn't look at them. I looked at my cup. Estate things, just to be prepared. My son leaned back, forcing a chuckle. Mom, you don't need to worry about that stuff. We've got it all covered. I met his eyes. I know. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. They exchanged a glance. Not long, just a flicker, but enough. I realized I went on that I've let you both take on so much responsibility for me, and I'm grateful. But I've been thinking, maybe I should make sure my wishes are written down properly. That way there's no confusion later. That's smart, she said, cautious. I reached for the folder on the coffee table. I saw a lawyer. We made some changes. My accounts. The house. A few other things. Her teacup paused midair. My son's phone screen went dark. I've put everything into a trust, I said, my voice steady. The trust will handle my property and assets when the time comes. It's all very clean. Very simple. No probate. No delays. Silence. Even the fire seemed quieter. That's good, my son said finally. And, who's the trustee? Not you, I said. Not unkindly, but without hesitation. It's a professional. Someone with no personal interest in my estate. My lawyer thought it best. Her cup clinked against the saucer. My son's eyes sharpened just for a moment before he forced them back into something softer. Well, I wish you'd talk to us first, he said. I sipped my tea. I didn't want to trouble you. You've been so busy. And besides, this way, no one has to worry about handling my affairs while grieving. Everything's already in place. They didn't know what to say to that. I could see them running the numbers in their heads, trying to map out what might still be within reach. I knew what they were looking for, a gap in my armor, some detail they could work around. I leaned forward slightly. There's something else. I've also arranged my will so that certain obligations are met directly through the trust. No one will need to sign anything after I'm gone. No one will have to manage accounts. It's all automated. Obligations, she asked. Yes, I said, smiling faintly. Donations. Educational funds. Some personal gifts to people who've been part of my life for many years, all very specific. It was subtle, but I saw it, the realization settling in. Whatever they'd been counting on was no longer certain. My son nodded slowly, as if agreeing with a plan he didn't like but couldn't openly challenge. "If that's what you want, Mom." "It is," I said. "It's exactly what I want." We finished our tea in polite silence. They left not long after, both of them quieter than when they'd arrived. At the door, my son hugged me. I could feel his hands pressing slightly against my back, like he was searching for something solid to hold on to. I didn't hug him back as tightly as I used to, not because I loved him less, but because I needed him to feel the space between us. When the door closed, I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the sound of their car pulling away. I knew the next chapter wouldn't be calm. They'd push, they'd probe, but the line had been drawn, and now they knew I was the one who'd drawn it. The first tremor came as a text from my sister. "Did you really cut him out?" No greeting, no context, just the blunt edge of gossip turned into a blade. I stared at the screen and put the phone face down on the table. I didn't reply. 10 minutes later, she called. I let it ring. On the third try, I answered. She didn't waste breath. "He's devastated," she said. "You blindsided your own child." I told her I wasn't discussing my affairs by telephone. I kept my voice even. She huffed, said, "You've changed," and hung up. I stood by the sink until the quiet settled again. It moved faster after that. A cousin I hadn't heard from in 2 years sent a long message about family obligations and honoring the people who care for you. A neighbor mentioned too brightly that she'd heard about the trust thing. The checker at the market asked if my son was okay. I kept my answers small. "We're working things out. I'm fine. Thanks for asking." Gossip is hungry, but it starves without details. I gave it none. They tried other doors. She called one afternoon with tears already in her voice. I felt so blindsided, she said, like we were being replaced by strangers. I told her the trustee was not a stranger to me. I told her I had chosen him carefully. She sniffed and said, "We've always been there for you." I said, "You've been present." She went quiet at that. Then she tried the softer path. "We love you," she said. "This feels like punishment." I said I wasn't interested in punishment. I was interested in clarity. She hung up without saying goodbye. The next week, my son arrived without calling. He walked in like he still had a key to my judgment. He paced my living room and gave me a speech about what families do and how hurt he felt. I listened. Then I asked him to sit. I told him I expected no more discussions about my estate. I told him any questions could go through my lawyer. He looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "Your lawyer," he repeated as if the word itself were a betrayal. "Yes," I said. "My lawyer." I watched the moment he realized the ground had shifted and it would not shift back. Their next attempt was to paint the picture for others. Church friends began sending praying hands emojis to my phone. One left a casserole with a note that said, "We're here if you need to talk about family conflict." I thanked her for the food and said nothing else. Silence again doing its work. The fewer explanations I gave, the less material there was for interpretation. People dislike rooms without furniture. They hesitate to enter. The noise slowed. They tried the legal bluff. A terse email arrived, addressed "Dear Mother," copied to an address I recognized as a friend of theirs who knew about trusts. The message claimed I had made hasty decisions under duress and requested a meeting to reevaluate the structure. My lawyer responded before I finished my tea. His reply was simple: My client is of sound mind and acted with full understanding. Any further attempts to interfere will be construed as harassment. He copied them on a short list of statutes. He used words that closed doors. Then came the welfare check. 2 uniformed officers at my door on a Tuesday. We received a concern about your well-being, one said, glancing behind me as if expecting chaos. I invited them in. I poured coffee. I showed them my medication list, my calendar, the fresh groceries, the clear sink, the neatly folded laundry. I handed them the letter my doctor had written months ago at my request, a note confirming my cognition and independence. The older officer folded it and tucked it back into the envelope for me. He said, "Ma'am, we're sorry for the inconvenience." I smiled. I'm not inconvenienced. They left more gently than they arrived. My grandson came the next day. He hovered in the doorway, shoulders tight, eyes searching. "They're saying you're not yourself," he said. "They're saying you're being controlled." The word was a mirror. I asked him to walk with me. We went to the garden brown and resting in the cold. I told him that people who lose access to something they counted on will call the new arrangement cruelty. I told him control can look like help when you don't read the fine print. He looked at the empty beds as if trying to read something there. He said, "I don't know what to believe." I said, "You don't have to choose today." He asked about the money he sent me. He said he wanted to make sure I was comfortable. Does the 9,000 cover everything? That number landed softer now, but still with weight. I told him my needs were met. I told him I had redirected his transfers into a separate account in my name alone. I told him I hadn't touched $1 since autumn. He blinked. Why, I said, because someday you might want to know where your help actually went. He didn't answer. He dug the toe of his shoe into the dirt and said he would keep sending it for now. I nodded. He hugged me without leaning his weight on me as if afraid to press. The backlash at home turned practical. They delayed my grocery deliveries twice. Technical glitch, she said. I went out and stocked my pantry myself. They forgot to pay the electricity bill they used to handle. I paid it online from my new account and took a photo of the confirmation. The quiet revenge of competence has its own flavor. It tastes like clean receipts and uninterrupted light. Their public front began to crack. A friend of theirs, someone loud and loyal when times were easy, posted a photo from a party with a caption about fake people who abandon you when you're down. She tagged no one. She meant everyone. 2 weeks later, that same friend started a side business and solicited me for an order. I declined. The message I sent was polite. The message I meant was not. By early spring, their finances showed through the seams. A supplier called my landline asking for my son. He listed this as a secondary number, the man said, annoyed. He mentioned an overdue invoice. He mentioned a pattern. I said I couldn't help him and gave him my son's mobile. I wrote down the date and time. I added it to the file. She tried again, softer this time. She came alone on a Sunday, hair unbrushed, eyes ringed with the kind of exhaustion you can't fake. She sat at my table and said, "I don't know how to fix this." I poured tea. I said, "Start with the truth." She closed her eyes and shook her head. "The truth is messy," she said. "Mine isn't," I said. She didn't ask what my truth was. She already knew. She left with her teacup half full. The next letter was from my lawyer sent to me for records. He had filed notices with the bank to remove any care of forwarding addresses from my accounts. He had confirmed with the county that all property tax correspondence would come to my mailbox only. He had added my doctor's note and a recent cognitive assessment to my trust packet. Redundancy is protection, he'd written in the margin in his tidy hand. I slipped the letter into the fireproof box. The box felt light and unbreakable at the same time. I found myself sleeping better, not deeper, but steadier. I woke without the old knot behind my ribs. I made breakfast and ate all of it. I cleaned out the drawer where I used to keep the emergency cash my son always found a reason to borrow. I put a small chrysanthemum there instead, a stubborn flower even when the season is wrong. It cheered me every time I opened the drawer to find nothing missing. There were consequences I didn't enjoy. Family gatherings cooled. Invitations that did arrive felt edged with interrogation. I attended one, brought a pie, sat at the end of the table, and refused to perform regret. When a cousin asked loudly if I thought trusts were for rich people, I said trusts are for people who understand risk. The room went quiet for a beat, then shifted to football scores. That was enough. Through all of it, I kept my rule: no shouting, no public scenes, no explanations longer than a sentence. I let reality do the heavy lifting. Bills paid on time, house in order, doctor appointments kept, a life arranged by my hands, visible to anyone who bothered to look past their narrative. The aftermath wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. That was the point. What they learned slowly and against their will was that proximity is not ownership. Being helpful is not the same as being honest. And that I, the woman who labeled flour and sugar and rice, had labeled something else too, the boundaries of my life, and taped them shut where no one could pry without leaving fingerprints. Their fingerprints were all over everything. I didn't need to accuse them. I only needed to stop providing the surface. The calls grew less urgent, the messages shorter, the gossip starved. In the quiet that followed, I could hear my own breath again. I could hear the heater kick on the kettle whistle, the small domestic sounds that used to drown under worry. The backlash didn't disappear. It relocated to their own kitchen, their own bills, their own late-night conversations. My part was over. My line was drawn, and I stood on my side of it without apology. By summer, the dust had mostly settled, but I knew better than to believe it was over. Silence doesn't always mean surrender. It can mean they're regrouping. That's why I decided it was time to close the last gap in my defenses, the legal safety net. I made an appointment with my lawyer for a full audit of everything we'd put in place. I wanted him to go through it like he was looking for holes in a stranger's plan, not mine. He did exactly that. For 3 hours, we combed through every account, title, and clause. We confirmed the pension was redirected solely to my name. We verified the trust could not be challenged without meeting conditions so strict they'd require proof of coercion or fraud, neither of which existed. Then we went further. I gave him the contact information for 2 trusted friends, Carol and Mrs. Adams, naming them as secondary points of verification for my well-being. If anyone ever tried to claim I was unfit, my lawyer would reach out to them before any action could be taken. He also suggested I appoint a professional trustee to replace him if something happened. I agreed, and he handled it quietly. Every signature tightened the weave. At home, I started putting together what I called my second book. The first notebook, the one with all the dates and amounts, was for documenting the past. The second book was for instructions, where things were stored, which keys opened what. The passwords to accounts encrypted in a code only Carol knew. It wasn't paranoia, it was insurance. I'd learned the hard way that assuming people will do the right thing was not a plan, it was an invitation. Around the same time, I decided to simplify my finances even more. I sold a small plot of land I'd inherited decades ago, the one my son once called our backup plan. The proceeds went straight into the trust. I didn't tell anyone. The fewer pieces left lying around, the less there was for curious hands to grasp. They must have sensed something tightening, even if they couldn't name it. My son came by one afternoon and mentioned in a casual tone that he'd heard the market was good for selling land. I stirred sugar into my tea and said, "Yes, I heard that too." His eyes lingered on me for a beat before he changed the subject. She, on the other hand, tried charm. She arrived alone with a bouquet of lilies, saying she'd missed our chats. We talked about safe topics, recipes, the neighbor's new fence, the heat wave coming. Then she slipped it in. "If you ever need help sorting through your papers, I'm happy to take a look." I smiled and said, "That's kind, but I have everything just how I want it." She nodded, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. It wasn't just about protecting money anymore. It was about protecting the space I lived in, physically and mentally. I had my locks rekeyed. I installed a small camera above the back door, not because I expected trouble, but because I liked the idea of seeing who came and went. I started using a safe deposit box at the bank for certain documents. Carol checked in on me often, sometimes under the guise of borrowing sugar or dropping off muffins. She'd glance around, see the tidy counters, the well-stocked fridge, and nod to herself. She was my quiet witness proof against any claims that I was slipping. By early August, I felt the shift. The anxiety that used to sit at the back of my neck like a hand pressing down had loosened. I could walk into my own kitchen without scanning for signs someone else had been there. I could go to bed knowing the accounts were untouchable, the house was legally sealed, and my story was written in ink they couldn't erase. That's when I realized something important. The safety net wasn't just for when I was gone. It was for now. It let me live without the constant hum of fear, without the feeling that every knock on the door might be someone trying to take another piece. I decided to test the waters. The next time my son visited, I mentioned offhand that I'd been to the bank. His fork paused halfway to his mouth for what he asked. I took a sip of tea, just checking on things, making sure everything's in order. He didn't press, but I saw the tightening in his jaw. That night, my lawyer emailed me, "Got a call today from your son asking if he could be added as a co-trustee, just in case. Declined per your standing instructions." I read the message twice, then deleted it. I didn't need to respond. My answer had already been given written in every clause, every signature, every choice I'd made. The net was secure, and from here on I could decide just how visible that net would be to the people who once thought they owned it. The unraveling wasn't sudden, it was a slow bleed. By autumn, the stories about them were reaching me without my asking. A woman from church mentioned that my son's business had downsized. The man who delivered my firewood said they'd missed a payment for their own order. It wasn't gossip I sought, but it came to me like wind slipping under the door. I saw it in smaller ways too. The once new car they drove to my house now had a crack in the windshield that stayed for weeks. She stopped arriving with fresh flowers, bringing store-brand cookies instead. He talked less about their investment opportunities and more about tight seasons. The cracks widened when they began missing their own cues. One Sunday, he complained about the rising cost of utilities. 3 days later, I overheard him telling someone on the phone that they'd just installed a heated bathroom floor. That kind of carelessness happens when people are tired. The most telling sign came from my grandson. He showed up one afternoon wearing the same jacket I'd seen in a photo months earlier, only now it was fraying at the cuffs. He mentioned almost casually that his parents had asked him to help cover a bill for the first time. I kept my face neutral, but inside I knew they'd turned inward looking for resources wherever they could find them. The world outside my trust was closing in. I didn't rejoice. There's no pleasure in watching your own blood stumble. But I also didn't rush in with a cushion. That instinct to patch every hole before it leaks had nearly cost me my independence. I was done carrying their weight while they chipped away at mine. They tried subtle re-entry. My son called to say he missed our Sunday tradition and wanted to start coming by again. I agreed, but made sure the visits were on my terms, set times, short durations, no access to my office or bedroom where I kept files. The first time they came back for lunch, I served tea and soup, then sent them home with leftovers. The boundaries were quiet but firm. I noticed the differences immediately. They no longer spoke with the casual authority of people who believed they held the keys to my life. There was a tentative edge to their questions, a watchfulness in their tone. They were trying to read the map of my new arrangement without admitting they didn't have a copy. Publicly, the unraveling became harder for them to hide. A friend of theirs confided without realizing her words would reach me that their business had lost a major contract. Another said they'd been late on rent for their storefront. I knew enough about the rhythm of money to understand what that meant. The reserves were gone, and yet they never asked me outright for help. Pride, maybe. Or the knowledge that the help wouldn't come in the form they wanted. If they'd asked, I would have offered groceries a bill paid directly, maybe even some cash for my grandson's schooling, but never the open faucet they once enjoyed. They began to shrink socially. Invitations they used to accept were declined. Photos of dinners out were replaced with quiet evenings at home. She started selling small items online, home decor pieces I recognized from their apartment. He took on extra contract work traveling, more posting, less. When I saw my grandson for his birthday, he mentioned his parents had been arguing about selling something big. He didn't know what. I did. It wasn't hard to guess the car or a piece of jewelry would be next. The signs were there in the hesitation before they spoke about plans, in the way she looked at him when money came up, like they were both balancing on the same thin wire. Through all of it, I stayed steady. Bills paid, groceries stocked, doctor visits kept. I knew stability was its own quiet statement, proof that their absence from my accounts hadn't left me struggling. If anything, I looked stronger now than when they managed things. The final confirmation of their decline came in November. My son showed up alone, no call, no pretense this time. He sat at my table, not touching the tea I'd poured, and said, "We're in a tight spot. Not asking for money, just things are bad." I nodded. "I'm sorry to hear that." He waited for more, maybe for the part where I'd lean forward and offer to fix it. When I didn't, he gave a small humorless laugh. "You've changed." "No," I said. "I've stopped letting other people change my plans." He didn't argue. He just stood, thanked me for the tea, and left. I watched from the window as he walked to his car, shoulders slightly hunched, the weight visible. That evening, I sat with my second book open and added one more note. Today he realized the door is locked. The unraveling wasn't mine to stop. It was theirs to live through. And I would not let their storm reach my shore again. The knock on my door that February afternoon was softer than usual, almost hesitant. When I opened it, my grandson stood there alone, hands shoved into his coat pockets, eyes darting toward the street as if to make sure no one had followed him. "Can I come in, Grandma?" I stepped aside, and he walked straight to the kitchen table, dropping into a chair like he'd been carrying his weight all day. I made tea without asking if he wanted it. Sometimes you don't need to ask. "They've been different lately," he said, not looking at me. "More arguments, more bills. They told me I might have to take a break from school for a semester." I sat across from him, keeping my hands wrapped around my mug. "Because of money?" He nodded. "They said they just need time to get things in order, but I know that means they don't have it." He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking maybe I could just live with you for a while. Help you out, and you could help me out." It would have been easy to say yes right there, to open the door to both him and the trouble that would inevitably follow. But I'd spent too long learning that help without boundaries is just another form of surrender. "I'll always have a place for you," I said carefully, "but you need to understand something. I can help you without putting myself back in the position I was in before. That means certain lines stay where they are." He frowned, not fully grasping the weight of my words. "They said you don't trust them anymore." "That's true," I said simply. "And it's not something I decided overnight. It took years of watching." His gaze flicked up to meet mine. "They think you're punishing them." I sipped my tea. "Then they don't understand the difference between punishment and consequence." He didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he asked about the money he sent me every month. "You still haven't used any of it, have you?" "No," I said. "It's in a separate account with your name on the file. If you need it for school, it's there." He blinked as if he hadn't considered that possibility. "Why didn't you just tell me?" "Because I wanted you to decide when you were ready. Not because I told you to." The silence that followed was heavier than our words. He was piecing together more than I was saying out loud about where the real cracks had been and why I'd chosen to protect myself in the way I had. Before he left, he stood in the doorway, looking older than the boy who used to run through my garden with sticky hands and grass-stained knees. "Grandma, I think I get it now. Not all the way, but I get it." "That's enough for today," I said. After he drove off, I sat back at the kitchen table and thought about what had just happened. This was the first time in years that a conversation about money with a family member hadn't felt like a trap. He hadn't asked for my accounts, my passwords, my property. He'd asked for space. And in return, I'd given him a kind of safety no one else in his household had offered, a plan that didn't involve taking something away from me to give to him. Still, I knew he'd go home to their voices, their stories, their versions of me. They'd tell him I'd changed, that I'd closed myself off, maybe even that I'd been manipulated. And maybe he'd believe some of it. But a seed had been planted, and seeds don't care what stories you tell around them. They grow when they're ready. That night I took the envelope with his name from my safe and moved it to the front. Inside was a full record of every transfer he'd made to me since the beginning, along with the current balance and interest earned. If he ever came to me ready for the truth in numbers, I wanted it to be the first thing I handed him. I didn't know if he'd end up following in their footsteps or stepping away from them. That wasn't my choice to make. But I could make sure that when his moment came, whether it was next month or 10 years from now, he'd see that I'd been protecting him too, even when he didn't know he needed it. Sometimes the real work of protecting your future isn't in locking doors. It's in keeping one unlocked for the right person at the right time. It was late March when my son came by for what I knew would be the last real attempt. He called first unusual for him and asked if I was free for a serious talk. His voice was steady but too careful, the way people speak when they've practiced their lines. I made tea and set out 2 cups. No shortbread this time. I wanted the table bare. When he arrived, he stood just inside the doorway for a moment, scanning the room as if to take inventory. We sat. He didn't waste time. "Mom, I think we need to put the past behind us." "I have," I said. His jaw tightened, but he kept going. "I mean, all of it. The trust, the lawyer, the way things have been handled. We can't keep living like strangers." "We're not strangers," I said. "We just have separate responsibilities now." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "But it doesn't have to be this way. You know I've always looked out for you. We've always handled things together." I didn't answer. I let the pause stretch until he sat back unsettled. Then he tried a softer note. "I'm worried about you, Mom. About your health. What if something happens? Who's going to be there?" "The people I've chosen," I said. "And they know exactly what to do." That's when the mask cracked. "Why not me?" he asked. "Why not family?" I looked at him for a long moment. "Because family isn't just about blood. It's about trust. And trust has to be earned and kept." His hands curled into fists on the table, then relaxed. "So this is about money. It's about respect," I said. "And the difference between helping and taking over." He didn't speak for a while after that. I could see the calculations in his eyes, the temptation to argue, the urge to charm, the flicker of frustration when neither worked. Finally, he sighed and said, "I guess there's nothing more to say then." "There's plenty more to say," I told him, "just not about money." We talked about the weather, my garden plans, his son's classes. He smiled in the right places, but there was distance now, the kind you don't measure in miles. When he stood to leave, he hugged me briefly, politely, not the kind of hug that lingers. After the door closed, I stayed at the table for a long time. The air felt lighter, but also final. I knew that conversation was the pivot point. From here on, whatever relationship we had would live within the boundaries I'd set. That evening, I called my lawyer. I told him to add a note to my file. No revisions, no cosigners, no access granted under any circumstances without written consent. He said it was already there. I asked him to keep it in bold. Over the next week, the distance became visible. Fewer texts. No surprise visits. My grandson still came by now and then, but never with both of them. When he asked how the talk with his dad went, I said, "We're in a new chapter now." That was all. It wasn't anger that settled over me, it was clarity. I could still love my son. I could still wish him well. But I no longer had to give him the keys to my life for that love to count. The funny thing about boundaries is that once you've lived with them for a while, you stop seeing them as walls. They're just the shape of the space you've chosen to keep safe. I went back to my garden. I planted early lettuce knowing the frost might take a few leaves, but the rest would survive. That's how it felt with us now, some things lost, some things protected, and the knowledge that what grew from here would be mine to tend. 2 years later, I stood in the back row of the university auditorium, watching my grandson cross the stage in his cap and gown. His name was called, the crowd clapped, and I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the spring sun streaming through the high windows. He spotted me afterward, weaving through the sea of people with his diploma in hand. "Grandma," he called, smiling wide. He hugged me, not the polite arms-only hug his father had given me 2 years before, but a real one, the kind where you feel the heartbeat on the other side. "You made it," I said. "We made it," he corrected. Then softer, "I wouldn't have if you hadn't kept that account for me." I didn't ask how he'd found out. Maybe he'd finally looked at the statements I'd left for him. Maybe he'd just put the pieces together. It didn't matter. He knew. That was enough. His parents were there too, of course. I saw them across the crowd, his mother adjusting her scarf, his father scanning for someone to talk to. Our eyes met briefly. No smiles, no nods. Just acknowledgement. We existed in parallel now, each with our own gravity. The reception afterward was crowded and loud. My grandson stuck close to me, introducing me to his friends as the one who taught me how to stretch $1 and a pot of soup. I laughed, but there was truth in it. The lessons I'd kept for him had survived even when the rest of the family ties had frayed. When the speeches were over and people began drifting toward the doors, he walked me to my car. I handed him an envelope. "For what's next?" I said. He started to protest, but I held up my hand. "It's yours. Always was." Inside that envelope was not just the savings from his monthly transfers, but the interest the land sale proceeds I'd set aside in his name, and a note in my handwriting. "This is your foundation. Build wisely, and never let anyone else hold the pen." He didn't open it then. He just tucked it into his jacket and hugged me again. "Thank you," he said. His voice was different now, older, steadier. As I drove home, the windows down, I thought about the long road that had led here, the years of sacrifice when my son was young, the slow encroachment when I let others manage my life, the silent gathering of my defenses, the confrontation without shouting, the aftermath that tested my patience, and finally this closure on my terms. Forgiveness had never been the goal. What I'd found instead was something quieter, but just as valuable: peace with boundaries. I could love my son from a distance, hope for his well-being, and still protect myself from the parts of him I couldn't trust. The house felt different when I walked in that evening, lighter, almost as if it knew the final chapter had been written. I put the kettle on, set my cup on the counter, and glanced at the fireproof box in the corner. The lock stayed in place, but the weight inside felt less like a shield now and more like a record of what I'd survived. I sat in my armchair, the late sun warming my legs, and thought about the legacy I was leaving. Not just in money or property, but in example. My grandson had seen it firsthand, how to hold your ground without losing your dignity, how to plan for the future without handing it over to someone else, how to survive betrayal without letting it define the rest of your life. I didn't need a grand speech or an audience to mark the moment. This was my closure, quiet, certain, mine.